When we think about India, we think about the country that we see today. But who are the Indians? Where do their ancestors come from? And for the last few years, actually a lot longer than that, I have been reading on the ancient Aryan migrations and how really India was, in far antiquity, conquered by an Aryan people. India was conquered by the Aryans. And if you look at a lot of modern day research on the ancient Aryans and how they migrated into India, what we find out is that the 19th century European scholars who said that India was invaded by the Aryans were correct. And for so long, we have been saying, oh no, that's a myth. The idea of the Aryan invasion of India, that's all just, made up by the British to justify colonialism and all that stuff. But when you actually look at genetic research, archaeological research, what you find is that those 19th century European scholars, and also scholars from the early 20th century, they were correct. These people were right. India was invaded by the Aryans. When you look at geography and archaeology, and when you look at genetics, it really does confirm this reality. There were numerous ancient Aryan cultures, and they were scattered around Europe, and they were also within Eurasia. And in ancient Eurasia and also in Eastern Europe, you find these Aryan cultures that were related. So, for example, you have the corded ware culture, you have the Santashta culture, you have the Andronoval culture. All of these cultures were Aryan. They had their differences, but nonetheless, at the end of the day, they were Aryan peoples, and their settlements were Aryan. Their pottery, their art, their artwork, all of these things were Aryan. They were all part of the Aryan culture. Now, they were subcultures of the Aryan the main Aryan culture, but nonetheless, they were all Indo-European. And it was really these peoples who would later on invade India. You can find these ancient Aryan settlements in Ukraine. They have found them in Kazakhstan. They have found them in Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan. They have found them in Afghanistan. And it's super fascinating. So, I mean, I really don't see why it's so difficult to believe any of this stuff. When you look at a map, you have India, Pakistan, Iran. Now, really, if you think about it, and if you actually just forget the fact that Pakistan was created not so long ago, Iran really does border with India. Iran borders with India. Now you're going to say, well, no, Iran actually borders with Pakistan. Pakistan didn't come up into existence until what, like 1942? So really, Iran in ancient times bordered with India. So you have the Iranians and you have India bordering right with Iran. And so the idea of Aryan peoples, Indo-Iranian peoples migrating right into northern India is extremely realistic. In fact, when you look at the Dravidian culture, the ancient Dravidian culture, how did that come into existence? It came by native, indigenous peoples of India intermixing with Iranian nomads who migrated into India. Nomadic farmers from Iran, they migrated into India and they intermixed with the native population, just like the Spaniards intermixed with the indigenous people in Mexico or in the rest of South America, or like how English people and Scottish people and Irish people, they migrated into North America and they intermixed with the indigenous people there. What happened in ancient times has been going on for a very, very long time. And then you have the Indo-European migrations into India. And when you look at a map, it's very simple. You have India, and then next to India you have Iran, and then bordering with Iran you have Turkmenistan, and then bordering with Turkmenistan, you have Kazakhstan. And Kazakhstan is huge. It's a ginormous country. I think it's the biggest of all of the Central Asian countries. And then bordering with Kazakhstan, you have Russia. And then bordering with Russia, you have Ukraine. Right there on the Dnieper River. And on the Dnieper River, you had ancient Aryan settlements. And so, whether you look at these Aryan settlements in Ukraine, or in Kazakhstan, or in Kyrgyzstan, or Turkmenistan, or in Afghanistan, you will find that they all had similarities. Even though they were subgroups, they were still subgroups nonetheless of the same Indo-European people. And so you can see really this migration from the Caucasus, Kazakhstan, Ukraine. All these countries are very close to each other. Ukraine and the Caucasus, Russia, the Dnieper River. All these areas are quite close to each other. And so you can see this migration within this zone of adjacent regions. And then, you know, from Russia, you're right there in Kazakhstan. From Kazakhstan, you're right there in Turkmenistan. From Turkmenistan, you can go right into Iran. From Iran, you can go into Afghanistan. These areas are quite close to each other. From Afghanistan, you can go right into India. Afghanistan really was this corridor between Eurasia and India, the South Asian subcontinent. And so when you look at these ancient Aryan peoples who migrated into India, they had their own religion, obviously, and this religion entailed a socio-political, religious, ideological system. And when the Aryans invaded India, they did similarly to what the Spaniards did when they invaded the New World. They said, okay, the indigenous people, you're on the bottom part of the caste system. Then you have other peoples who are mixed with Aryan. They're somewhere in the middle. And then you have the Aryans, and we're on the top. And it was this socio-political religious system that was eventually percolated throughout northern India. And I was reading an article today. I'll post a link for it in the bottom so that you guys can read it for yourselves. It's very, very fascinating. It was from 2019. And it shows how these Aryan peoples, how they invaded India, and how when they invaded India, they really vanquished and conquered the Dravidian peoples of northern India. And then they caused a really something of a refugee migration situation where the Dravidians began to migrate to the south. And these Dravidian peoples would intermix with the indigenous peoples of South India. And that's where you have these South Indian peoples today. It's just a very fascinating topic. These Aryan peoples, they would bring with them the swastika. You know, the swastika, when we see the swastika, we think automatically Nazi Germany. Well, the Germans, the Nazis, they took the swastika and they saw it as a symbol of their religious aspiration of reviving ancient Aryan religion. And the swastika was indeed a part of Aryan religion. You can find the swastika in India. And in fact, you can find it in some ancient Roman archaeology. There's actually an ancient artifact from Rome, from ancient Rome, that shows a gladiatorial warrior with a shield in his hand, and engraved on the shield is a swastika. And archaeologists actually have difficulty trying to figure out what this swastika represented, and why would a swastika be on a Roman shield? Well, it's quite obvious that the ancient Romans were ultimately an Indo-European people. In fact, at one point in time, all the peoples of Europe pretty much spoke the Indo-European language. The ancient peoples of Italy, before the Roman people established themselves, before the idea of a Roman people actually came into conception, the ancient Italians spoke an Indo-European language. And the Roman language, the Latin language, really is a derivative of that Indo-European branch. And so it's not really that surprising to find a swastika on a Roman shield. And you can go into Ukraine, and you can go into Belarus, you can go to Russia, and you can find the swastika on traditional clothing. The Slavic swastika, the kalovrat, it's a part of the ancient Slavic history. And you will find the Slavic Nazis, Ukrainian Nazis or Belarusian Nazis, or Serbian Nazis, they will uphold this symbol because it is a part of their ancient history. And so they see themselves, just like the Nazi Germans did, as reviving the religion of their peoples. And they see Christianity as just a Semitic religion that came into their lands, into their countries at a recent date. And they don't like that. But these ancient Aryans, when they invaded India, they brought with them that swastika. And so they went to war with the indigenous peoples. They would eventually conquer them. And I just imagine these ancient Aryans just going into India, and they they obviously had this religious ideology that they used to justify what they were doing. They probably believed that the gods destined them for this. Another interesting thing is that in the Rig Veda, which is one of the most pertinent text in the Hindu religion, there are actually geographical locations that are mentioned, and some of these geographic locations are actually found in Afghanistan. Why? Because the Aryans who would enter India, they came in to India through Afghanistan. And I've also heard that a lot of these Aryans would also come in from Siberia. The Saka people, for example, are believed to have been people who migrated into India from Siberia. And so I just imagine these Aryans having this socio-political religious system that to them justified what they were doing, justified their expansionism. Religion and war were inseparable in ancient times. That's why you'll read stuff from the ancient Assyrian Empire. It talks about how the god Ashur led the king into battle, and he crushed the enemies, the king's enemies, and all those things. You can find this sort of thing in ancient Egypt. You can find it in ancient Babylon, Sumeria, the ancient Akkadian Empire. All of these empires had this idea that the gods were always with the king, and when the king won in war, it was actually the gods that were winning in the war. So the ancient Aryans had the same sort of system. That's why in ancient Hindu texts you can find really mythological descriptions of this Aryan migration and Aryan invasion. And I know a lot of Hindus would get so pissed off just hearing this sort of thing, but the reason why Hindus get so pissed off when they hear this sort of thing, and anytime they hear any sort of serious evidence for an Aryan invasion, they get so angry by it because in their own minds, in their own ideology and mentality, the Aryan peoples were native to India. India is the motherland of the Aryan race. And they don't like the idea that they actually were invaded by the Aryans. The indigenous peoples of India were, they were the Aboriginals. They were probably related to the Aboriginals of Australia, and they were invaded by a bunch of light-skinned Slavic people. They don't like to hear that sort of thing because they themselves are obsessed with race, and they probably hate themselves. They want to have this idea that their ancestors were, the ancestors of all the European race and all that stuff. They probably have these weird ideas. But it's interesting that later on, the Aryans would have a war amongst themselves in India. They call it the Battle of the 10 Kings, in which you had these 10 Aryan families that went to war with each other. And one of the families that was in this war was called Parsus. Parsus. And Parsus sounds like Persian. The Persian family, the Persian people. Because these Aryans were also in Iran. So you have Indo-Iranians, Indo-Europeans in ancient India. You had Scythians who entered India in ancient times and invaded and took over and conquered. And they began to kill each other. And then these Aryan clans, they began to make alliances with indigenous peoples to help them fight their fellow Aryan. So when you look at this ancient history, you find invasion, you find conquest, vanquishment. You also find the introduction of the swastika into India through the Aryan migration. And You know, today I was looking at a little documentary from Ukraine, and it was about these Ukrainian youths training in paramilitary training, and they're preparing for the Russian invasion of Ukraine. They believe that Russia is going to invade their country, and they're preparing for it. And I was looking at these Ukrainian peoples, and I'm thinking, you look at a lot of these faces of these Ukrainian peoples, and they almost look like they could be from Afghanistan. And when you realize that the peoples who would invade India and the peoples who would migrate into Afghanistan, when you realize that these peoples really were related to modern day Ukrainians and other Slavic peoples, Russians and all that, you can see the connection, and you can really see that the human family really isn't as far apart as we think it is. We think like, oh, the Ukrainian race, the Belarusian race, the Russian race. At one point in time, we were all pretty much all together. At one point in time, all the Europeans were together. They were all Indo-European. At one point in time, they all spoke the same language. And then they all started killing each other. But when you actually look at ancient history, you find out that we're actually a lot more related than we think we are. So I find this subject extremely fascinating. I want to write more on it. I want to talk more about it. And this video is really just a preliminary video on this subject that I want to get into. I'm going to be talking more about this, not every single video, obviously, but anytime I learn new things, I want to introduce it to you guys or talk about it with you guys. Anyway, let me know what you guys think. This is Theodore Shubat. You guys just heard some theology. God bless.